The Vannor Family Curse, a folklore investigation in the forgotten valleys of Appalachia, where the mist clings to ancient oaks like desperate prayers. There exists a family whose name is whispered only after sunset. The Vannors. For 7 generations, they've carried a burden so dark, so inexplicable, that even the local historians refuse to document it. But tonight, I'm going to tell you everything. I'm going to reveal what happened to every single daughter born into this cursed bloodline. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why some family secrets should remain buried forever. It started in 1847 with Elizabeth Vannor, the first daughter. She was only 16 when it happened. According to her mother's diary, which was discovered in a sealed wall cavity during a renovation in 1952, Elizabeth had been acting strangely for weeks. She'd wake up with dirt under her fingernails despite going to bed with clean hands. She'd speak in her sleep using words from a language no one in the family recognized. Then came that October night, the night everything changed forever. At exactly midnight, Elizabeth's mother heard the bedroom door creak open. She assumed her daughter was getting water, but when she checked Elizabeth's room, the bed was empty. The window was wide open, curtains billowing in the cold autumn wind, and Elizabeth was gone. They searched for 3 days. The entire town formed search parties. They combed through the woods, dragged the river, questioned every traveler passing through. Nothing. No trace, no clues, no body. Then, on the 4th morning, Elizabeth walked through the front door as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Elizabeth's eyes, once a warm hazel, had turned completely black, like pools of ink with no reflection. She didn't speak for a week, just sat in the corner of her room, rocking back and forth, clutching something in her closed fist. When her mother finally pried her fingers open, they found a small wooden doll, crudely carved, with symbols etched into its surface that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Elizabeth kept that doll for the rest of her life, which wasn't very long. She died at 19, in childbirth, delivering a baby girl who would inherit the curse. But before she died, Elizabeth whispered something to the midwife, something that was recorded in the town records. She came for me at midnight. She showed me where we all come from. She gave me this to remember. Every daughter must go. Every daughter must bring something back. This is the price we pay for being born. The pattern continued with horrifying consistency. In 1869, Elizabeth's daughter, Margaret, vanished at midnight on her 16th birthday. 3 days later, she returned with a mirror that showed reflections of people who weren't in the room. In 1891, Margaret's daughter Catherine disappeared and came back carrying a music box that played a melody no one had ever heard before. A melody that made people cry uncontrollably when they heard it. In 1913, Catherine's daughter Alice vanished and returned with a book, written in that same unknown language, filled with illustrations of creatures that seemed anatomically impossible, yet disturbingly real. Each daughter, each generation, the same terrifying ritual: midnight disappearance, 3 days of absence, return with an object, and those eyes. Always those completely black, soulless eyes. Now here's where it gets absolutely chilling. In 1967, a paranormal researcher named Dr. Samuel Corrigan became obsessed with the Vannor case. He spent 2 years investigating, interviewing family members, examining the objects each daughter had brought back. He documented everything in a series of recordings that were later found in his abandoned office. In one recording, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement, he describes an experiment he conducted. He gathered all the objects together in one room: the doll, the mirror, the music box, the book, and several others I haven't mentioned yet. When he arranged them in a specific pattern based on the symbols carved into each object, something extraordinary happened. The air in the room began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in seconds, and then he saw her, the entity, the thing that had been taking the Vannor daughters for over a century. Dr. Corrigan described her as simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed. She appeared as a woman, but her proportions were slightly wrong, like someone had tried to recreate a human from memory, but couldn't quite get the details right. Her skin was translucent, showing networks of what looked like roots or veins running beneath the surface. She wore a dress made of what appeared to be moth wings and spider silk, constantly shifting and reforming. But her face, God, her face was what broke him. It was every woman who had ever lived and died, constantly morphing, aging and youthing in rapid succession. One moment she'd look like a young girl, innocent and sweet. The next, she'd be an ancient crone with skin like dried leather. And her eyes were exactly like the eyes of every Vannor daughter who had returned from their midnight journey. Completely black, completely empty, completely knowing. She spoke to him, Dr. Corrigan claimed, though not with words. The knowledge just appeared in his mind like memories that weren't his own. She told him about the pact. In 1847, Thomas Vannor, Elizabeth's father, had been a desperate man. His crops were failing, his livestock dying, his family starving. In his desperation, he ventured deep into the old-growth forest, to a place the local Native Americans had warned settlers never to go. A place where reality was thin, where the barriers between worlds were like tissue paper. He performed a ritual he'd found in a book stolen from a traveling occultist, offering anything, everything for prosperity and success. And something answered. The entity, the thing Dr. Corrigan saw in that room, had accepted his offer. But the price wasn't his soul or his life. The price was every daughter born to his bloodline. They would be called at 16, taken for 3 days, shown the truth of existence, the reality behind reality, and then returned as messengers. The objects they brought back were anchors, pieces of that other realm bleeding into ours. Thomas Vannor's fortune changed overnight after making that pact. His next harvest was the most bountiful the county had ever seen. His businesses flourished. He became wealthy beyond imagination, but he never had another peaceful night's sleep. Because 9 months after the ritual, his wife gave birth to Elizabeth, and he knew, somehow he just knew, what he'd done. He tried to break the pact. He burned the stolen book, destroyed the altar he'd built in the forest, even tried to send Elizabeth away to live with relatives in another state. Nothing worked. The entity wouldn't be denied what it was owed. Thomas died in 1850, found hanging in his barn, though no one could explain how he'd managed to string himself up 20 feet in the air, with no ladder or means of reaching the beam. Dr. Corrigan's recordings end abruptly. The last tape contains just 20 minutes of him breathing heavily, occasionally whimpering, and then a sound like tearing fabric, a scream and silence. His body was never found. His office was discovered 3 months later by his landlord, the door locked from the inside, windows sealed, but Corrigan was gone. The only thing left was his recording equipment and a new object sitting on his desk, a photograph in an old brass frame. The photograph showed Dr. Corrigan standing in what looked like an endless hallway made of bone and shadow, and beside him, holding his hand like a child holds a parent's hand, was the entity. He was smiling in the photo. Or at least, his mouth was formed into the shape of a smile. His eyes told a different story. His eyes were completely black. But the Vannor Curse didn't end with Dr. Corrigan's disappearance. It continued. In 1985, 16-year-old Rebecca Vannor vanished at midnight and returned 3 days later with a telephone that would ring at random times. When you answered, you'd hear voices of people who had died, speaking about events that hadn't happened yet. In 2003, her daughter Melissa disappeared and came back with a Polaroid camera that took pictures of how people would die. She took one photo of herself, saw what was coming, and spent the next 13 years trying to prevent it. It didn't matter. What the camera showed always came true. And in 2019, Melissa's daughter Emma was taken at midnight on her 16th birthday. Emma's case is different though, and this is why I'm telling you this story now, why this needs to be heard, needs to be shared, needs to go viral, because maybe, just maybe, collective awareness can break curses that individual effort cannot. Emma Vannor returned from her 3-day absence, but unlike her ancestors, she remembered everything. The other daughters had always come back with fragmented memories, pieces of a nightmare they couldn't quite recall. Emma remembered it all, and she wrote it down, every single detail, in a manuscript that was leaked online last month by an anonymous source. I've read it. I've read every terrifying page, and I need you to understand what these girls experience, what they're forced to witness, what they bring back into our world. Emma wrote that when midnight struck on her 16th birthday, she felt a pulling sensation in her chest, like an invisible hook had caught behind her sternum. She tried to resist, tried to scream, tried to grab onto her bed frame, but her body moved against her will. She walked to her window, climbed out, and began walking into the forest behind her house. She was aware, conscious, but completely unable to control her movements. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Time working differently in that space between worlds. The trees around her began to change, their bark becoming smooth and metallic, their leaves turning to glass that chimed in the wind like music, written for instruments that don't exist. Then she reached a clearing that shouldn't exist, a place that wasn't on any map, couldn't exist in normal, three-dimensional space. In the center stood a structure that Emma described as a house built by someone who had only heard descriptions of houses, but had never seen one. The proportions were wrong, the angles impossible, rooms that were somehow larger on the inside than the outside, doors that led to spaces that couldn't fit within the structure. And standing in the doorway was the entity, the same being Dr. Corrigan had seen, the thing that had been collecting Vannor daughters for over a century and a half. She beckoned Emma inside, and Emma's body obeyed, crossing the threshold into a nightmare-made architecture. Inside, Emma saw them all. Every Vannor daughter who had been taken stood in that impossible house, existing simultaneously as they were when taken, and as they would become after returning. Elizabeth, Margaret, Catherine, Alice, Rebecca, Melissa, dozens of others whose names were never recorded, all standing in a circle around a pit in the floor that descended into darkness so absolute it seemed to pull at Emma's vision, trying to drag her eyes into it. The entity spoke, and Emma heard it not with her ears but with every cell in her body, the words vibrating through her very existence. "You are the 47th daughter," the entity said. "You are the continuation of a promise, the fulfillment of a debt. Your ancestor offered his bloodline in exchange for prosperity, and I have collected my payment every generation. I take you to the place where reality is born, where possibilities crystallize into actuality. I show you the mechanisms behind existence, the truth that would shatter ordinary minds, and I send you back as witnesses, as warnings, as anchors for my influence in your world." Emma was then shown what she describes as the underneath of everything. She saw the fundamental structures of reality, the mathematical underpinnings of existence, the conscious architecture that holds the universe together. She saw that reality isn't solid, isn't fixed, but is constantly being negotiated between infinite possible states, and that entities like the one who had taken her exist in those spaces between states, feeding on the energy of collapsed possibilities. She saw that every choice, every decision, every moment creates branching timelines, and that these entities prune those branches, consuming the alternate realities that might have been. She saw that human consciousness is both a prison and a protection, limiting our perception, but also shielding us from truths that would dissolve our sense of self like sugar in water. For 3 days, Emma stood in that circle with her ancestors, absorbing knowledge that human brains weren't designed to hold, learning the vocabulary of creation and destruction, understanding the price of her great-great-great-great-grandfather's desperate bargain. And on the morning of the fourth day, the entity gave her the object, the anchor, the piece of that other realm she was required to bring back. It was a snow globe, but instead of water and glitter, it contained what looked like swirling darkness. When you shook it, the darkness would form into shapes, into scenes, into moments from possible futures or alternate pasts. Emma tried to refuse it. She begged to be released from the curse, offered anything else, offered herself permanently, offered to take the place of all future daughters. The entity just smiled with that terrible, shifting face and said, "The pact continues until the bloodline ends or the debt is paid in full. Your ancestor took abundance from possibility itself. The interest compounds. Every daughter I take, every object I send back, is a payment against that infinite debt." Emma returned home, snow globe clutched in her hands, eyes as black as void, and tried to resume her life. But how do you go back to normal after seeing behind the curtain of existence? How do you sit in a classroom and learn about history when you've seen the actual fabric of time? How do you laugh with friends when you know they're just probability clouds that have temporarily stabilized into the shape of human beings? She couldn't. Within 6 months, she'd withdrawn from school, stopped eating, stopped sleeping more than an hour or two at a time. The snow globe sat on her dresser, and sometimes at night, she'd hear it whispering, calling to her, showing her things that would happen, things that could happen, things that must never happen. The manuscript Emma wrote was her way of processing the trauma, of trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. In it, she describes each object brought back by previous daughters and what they really represent. The doll Elizabeth brought back in 1847 wasn't just a doll. It was a conduit, a tiny doorway through which the entity could observe the Vannor family, ensuring no daughter escaped her 16th year. The mirror Margaret brought back didn't just show reflections of people who weren't there. It showed alternate versions of people, the versions of themselves that existed in parallel timelines, the choices they didn't make, the lives they didn't live. The music box Catherine returned with didn't play a sad melody by accident. It played the mathematical frequency of grief itself, the universal vibration of loss that resonates across all conscious beings. Each object is a piece of invasion, a fragment of that other realm embedded in our reality like shrapnel. And with each generation, with each new object brought back, the barrier between worlds grows thinner. Emma theorized in her manuscript that this was the entity's true purpose, not just to collect on a debt, but to slowly, systematically weaken the walls between dimensions, to create enough anchors in our world that eventually the entity could cross over completely, bringing that impossible realm with it. The Vannor daughters aren't just victims, they're unwilling architects of an invasion that spans generations, each one adding another brick to a bridge between worlds. But here's the truly terrifying part, the reason I'm sharing this story with you, the reason this needs to be heard and shared and spread as far and wide as possible. Emma Vannor gave birth to a daughter 3 months ago. A baby girl, born into the Vannor bloodline, born into the curse. In 16 years, that child will be called at midnight, taken to that impossible house, shown the underneath of reality, and sent back with another object, another anchor, another piece of invasion. Unless something changes, unless the curse can be broken, Emma's manuscript contains a theory, a desperate hope. She writes that the entity exists partially through belief, through acknowledgement, through being witnessed and known. It feeds on the fear and secrecy surrounding the curse, grows stronger in the silence and hidden horror. But what if the story was told? What if the curse was exposed? What if millions of people knew about the Vannor daughters, knew about the pact, knew about the entity trying to bridge between worlds? Collective consciousness, Emma theorizes, might be able to do what individual will cannot. If enough people know, if enough people believe, if enough minds reject the entity's claims simultaneously, the pact might weaken. The curse might break. That's why the manuscript was leaked. That's why I'm telling this story. That's why I need you to listen, to share, to spread this as far as it can go. Somewhere in rural Appalachia, there's a baby girl who doesn't know that when she turns 16, something will come for her at midnight. Something that's been coming for Vannor daughters since 1847. Something that won't stop until the bloodline ends or the debt is paid or the curse is broken. And we, all of us listening to this, hearing this, sharing this, we might be her only hope. Because curses, real curses, ancient curses, curses born from desperate bargains with entities that exist in the spaces between reality. These curses are powerful. But you know what's more powerful? Belief. Collective belief. Millions of minds focused on one truth. The Vannor daughters will be free. Emma's daughter deserves to reach her 16th birthday without fear. She deserves to sleep through midnight without being pulled from her bed by invisible hooks. She deserves to live a normal life, free from the weight of her great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's mistake. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us know the story, if enough of us reject the pact, if enough of us stand as witnesses against the entity instead of silent bystanders, the next generation will be the last generation. The 48th daughter will be the daughter who breaks the chain forever. But it requires all of us. It requires this story to spread like wildfire, to become so known, so acknowledged, so universally recognized that the entity can no longer hide in shadows and secrecy. That's how we win. That's how we save her. That's how we end the curse that's haunted the Vannor family for 7 generations. So share this story. Tell everyone you know. Make the Vannor Curse so famous that the entity loses its power. Because in 16 years at midnight, something will come knocking. And we need to make sure that when it does, there are millions of us standing at that door, saying no, not this time, not this daughter, never again.